Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the role of food prices in contributing to, whether directly or indirectly, to some of the major revolutions of history. One of the revolutions that, of course, stands out is the French Revolution. Now, there was a lot of, just as a backstory, there was a lot of discontent already around the place with the inequity of the taxation system and the cost of living generally and that sort of thing. There'd been a couple of years of quite poor quality harvests in France, and France was typically, not always, but typically quite self-sufficient in food. They had that Mediterranean climate in the south of France, which meant that they could be producing vegetables, fruits and grains pretty much all year round. Now, because on the back of a couple of bad harvests, there was quite a harsh winter, and this sort of contributed to general discontent. Now, taxation was pretty harsh because with an already quite shaky financial situation, decided to help the American colonists in what was known as the War of Independence, which really was a civil war, British fighting each other. But the French decided to intervene on the side of the colonists simply to piss off the British. And at Yorktown, they were very decisive in bringing French stormtroopers, lots of siege cannons and heavy guns, and also a large naval contingent to blockade the port near Yorktown. So the French contribution was very substantial in supplying arms and armaments to the colonists and so on. So France really they just couldn't afford it, and they shouldn't have done it. And the debt that they were saddled with meant that they had to really screw the peasantry on taxation, and so this created a sense of discontent. And really, it was just waiting for a spark to set it off, and that spark was the food prices, or the price of bread in particular. And there are various deputations that went to the king's ministers and that sort of thing. And one of them was a large women's contingent. They worried about food for particularly the children. And the politicians said, well, hey, we're making some changes so that you've got more say in Parliament, or that we're making changes to the law and this sort of thing. Minor concessions that really weren't day-to-day relevant to these people's lives. And the women ringleaders just said, hey, we don't give a fuck about that. Give us bread. This is the solution. Solution is you get food out there. And the elites there were sort of, these morons, they're not even the shit on our shoes. Why should we bother about them? And everything will be fine. They'll just get hungry and die, and then that'll be the problem solved. And there was very much a dismissive attitude about it. And of course, once once people get hungry and their kids are hungry, then it changes. People will tolerate mistreatment, politically and legally to a point. But when they're hungry, their mum's hungry, their dad's just died of starvation, the kids are hungry, then people then they've got nothing to lose. They're prepared to die in order to solve the problem, because they perceive that if it goes on, they're going to die anyway. So why not take these hated elites with them? And so that's when revolutions really take off, and the people think, hey, we got nothing to lose here. So off they go. And of course, the French Revolution was these elites that were so contemptuous of the working classes. Thousands upon thousands of them were executed in the guillotine, and it just got completely out of control. It became arbitrary. You looked the wrong way on the street, you could be grabbed and taken before some bullshit, arbitrary street court, and then that's it. Yep, off to the guillotine with you. And so once these things start, they head off in unexpected and very undesirable directions, and it's hard to pull them back. It can take years to do it. If you look at the French Revolution in terms of time, it lasted for nearly 20 years. And that includes the Napoleonic period, of course. But anyway, that was the French Revolution. And if you look at, say, even the Bolshevik Revolution, or particularly the revolution that toppled the Tsar, in early 1917. That was brought on primarily by food prices, albeit as a primary result of that was World War One and those sorts of things. But it comes back constantly to food and the suffering of the people and how they then respond against the ruling elite. So now in the West, we're seeing a very substantial decline in the standard of living. And there's something called the bread index, and you can look it up online. And it looks at the price of bread going back hundreds of years, the price of bread relative to what would have been average wages, the cost of living and so on. It's adjusted for cost of living. So now I remember, when I was a kid, I'm old enough to remember when one of the fancier loaves of bread was 25 cents. Now that same fancy loaf of bread today is $7. So when we look at that's 28 times increase in price. Now there are cheaper loaves of bread, to be sure, smaller and cheaper, and more sawdust and whatnot in them. But in terms of like for like, apples for apples, then wages have increased by 11 or so times over that period, but the price of that same loaf of bread has increased 28 times. So this gives you an idea as to how much purchasing power in the West has declined. Now, again, there are cheaper loaves of bread, but if you compare like for like, that's the effect it's had, or the difference rather, in the reduction in purchasing power. So you can get less and less quality and that sort of thing. And just sort of in the supermarket over the last week or so, there's been some huge price rises. Price rises of 20%, 25% are now quite commonplace. There was one of the fancy bags of rice, a flavored rice that I used to often get. It's $5 a bag. That same bag is now $6. Went up 20% just in 1 week. And other examples, breakfast cereals, sauces, vegetables, some of the different cuts of meat, and so on. Now, the way the governments, the Western governments, have switched to a new type of measuring for inflation. So they look at it differently from the way they used to. They used to measure price increase. If the price is increasing, then that's inflationary, and it would be part of the calculation. And it could be anything. It'd be a basket of products that could be looked at. It could be I don't know, mustard or gravy or whatever. But there could be a whole basket of things. But the main things, of course, are things like rent and interest rates, car payments, mortgage payments. The staples tended to be included all the time, and then with a random sample of consumer goods. Now that's changed now. Instead of measuring that, the net increase and the net inflation, what they do is they superimpose an algorithmic thing on it, or maybe not even that sophisticated. What they say is that if the price goes up in something, could be gasoline or petroleum, if the price goes up, it's not inflationary because people just do less driving. They don't go out for the Sunday drive in the country. They stop taking their kids to school. They take the bus instead of the car to work, and this. So therefore, these price increases are not inflationary, and they just presume that there'll be changing patterns of behavior, which I don't doubt happen, by the way. But not everyone can just suddenly switch or change their behavior. Maybe they're not able to. Maybe they're not in an area that's got good transport links. Maybe they've got an elderly and sick relative that they go and see on Sunday at the nursing home. There can be a whole range of things, but it doesn't mean to just arbitrarily say the price increase is not inflationary is bullshit. That's clearly not the case. It is inflationary. The price has gone up. It's fucking inflationary. And they also apply this to other things, like the price of beef goes up. Now that the equation for measuring inflation says, well, the price of beef's gone up, therefore people won't eat beef, therefore it's not inflationary. They'll start eating, lamb chops instead, and so on. But the next month, lamb chops go up, and then, well, that's not inflation because people now eat beef. But beef went up the previous month, and so on. So they're just arbitrarily deciding say price increases are not inflationary. And this allows them to really reduce the inflation amount by probably 2/3 in the overall scheme of things. So if they're saying the inflation rate is, for example, 10%, then it's probably 30% in reality. And just looking around the supermarket over the last couple of weeks or so, then I'm seeing examples everywhere of price increases across the board, particularly in areas of cereals. But not confined to that. So what we're looking at is a situation where the Western pay packet is being squeezed quite heavily by inflation that is being deliberately, in my view, deliberately forced on us by the globalist elites as part of the Great Reset. And they're doing this, then claiming it's a crisis and then bestowing upon themselves more arbitrary powers that bypass the Constitution and the rule of law and due legal process and so on. So I'd like to come back to food as one of the basics. Now, the rich people aren't affected by food prices, or certainly not to any appreciable extent. So they can look at food prices being, who cares? But for people who are making, in the case of the United States, more than 60% of the population is paid less than $50,000 a year. Price rises in food and gasoline and this sort of thing, that hurts them. That beats them up. The paycheck becomes, ass paper. It becomes bum paper. It becomes useless, and they can't get by, and they start to get annoyed. And it's no point treating, well, they're all Nazis. If they can't afford to buy bread, they must be Hitler. That's nonsense, absolute nonsense. But it's what the globalists are pretty much pushing, which suggests, or it certainly indicates their utter contempt for anyone not in their class and not in their status of privilege. So I see a situation where when the pain reaches a certain point, and I think it's on the way there, that the control they think they have will start to evaporate, and people are going to start getting annoyed, particularly when they've got hungry relatives and hungry mum and dad, elderly mum and dad, hungry kids. That sort of thing. That's when the game changes, and the people who think they've got control start to lose it, and things can get pretty ugly at that point. Now, it's no good running around accusing them all of being white supremacist Nazis. That just isn't going to fly. They're getting away with it now, only just, and only because they've bought off the media to support them and support that narrative. But the reality is quite different. Now, because these people aren't themselves, the elites aren't themselves affected by food price. There's plenty of people around that can afford $1,000 a week for their groceries for two people, and they don't feel much pain as a consequence, if any. $2,000 a week, still $3,000 a week for groceries. That's when they'd start to, okay, this is getting a bit much. But they've got a long way to go before they feel pain. But that's only 1 in every 200 people that are have got those sort of bucks that they can be that blasé about food prices. But because they are blasé, they don't appreciate the pain that people in the bottom of the scale are feeling today. And really that should be addressed. And I believe these food price rises, gasoline prices and so on, are all artificial. None of them are needed. None of them organic. None of them are natural. They're all being forced upon us. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.